In the summer of 1988, a woman named Ruth Callahan stood in a field that hadn't seen rain in 61 days, staring at 11 bales of hay that were supposed to last her herd through winter. She gave every last one of them to a stranger she had never met. She didn't know his name. She didn't know where he was going. She didn't know if her own cattle would survive the choice she was about to make. All she knew was that a man had pulled his truck onto her gravel drive, hat in his hands, and asked for help he had no right to expect from someone who had none to spare. 20 years later, a truck pulled onto that same drive again. This time it was full. And the young man behind the wheel was about to tell Ruth Callahan something that would change how she understood every hard decision she had ever made in her life. Stay with me, because this story isn't just about hay. It's about what happens when kindness outlives the person who gave it, and comes back around when you need it the most. If you're new here, welcome to the Rural File, where we tell the true-to-life stories of the land, the people who worked it, and the debts that get repaid in ways nobody expects. Hit subscribe before we start, because you will not want to miss where this one goes. The summer of 1988 is still talked about in farm country, the way older generations talk about wars. It wasn't a bad season, it was a reckoning. Across the Midwest, the sky simply stopped delivering. No spring rains to speak of, no summer storms rolling through to green up the pastures, just sun, day after day, baking cornfields into brittle brown stalks and turning creek beds into cracked clay riverbeds you could walk across without wetting your boots. Ruth Callahan was 44 years old that summer, running 160 acres in a farming community where everybody's trouble was everybody's trouble. She'd taken over the operation 8 years earlier, after her husband Frank died of a heart attack out in the machine shed on a Tuesday morning in March. She hadn't planned on running the farm alone. Nobody plans on burying their husband at 40 either, but grief doesn't ask permission, and neither does a mortgage. By August of 1988, Ruth was down to a single crop of hay she'd managed to cut before the ground turned to dust. 11 round bales sitting in the shade of the hay barn, and every one of them accounted for in her herd, 100 times a day. She had 43 head of cattle. She'd done the math more times than she wanted to admit, and the math didn't work. 11 bales might get her through to first frost if she was careful, if nothing went wrong, if the winter was mild. That was a lot of ifs for a woman raising 2 teenagers on her own. Her daughter, Callie, was 16 that year. Her son, Danny, was 13. Both of them old enough to understand what an empty hay barn meant, even if they didn't say it out loud at the dinner table. "We'll figure it out," Ruth told them most nights, the way mothers do when they haven't figured it out at all. The whole county was in the same boat. Neighbors were selling off cattle at a loss just to keep from watching them starve. The feed store in town had a line out the door every morning, and half the time the shelves were bare by noon. People who had farmed the same land for 3 generations were talking, quietly, about whether this might be the year they finally sold out. Ruth wasn't going to be one of them. She'd buried a husband on this land. She wasn't about to let a drought take it too. It was a Thursday afternoon in late August when the truck came up the drive. Ruth was out by the barn, patching a fence line that had gone slack in the heat, when she heard the engine, an old Ford, running rough, trailing a thin plume of blue smoke that told her the man behind the wheel had been driving it a long way on not enough oil. The truck rolled to a stop a respectful distance from the house, the way strangers did back then when they didn't want to seem like they were pushing their way onto someone's property. A man climbed out, mid-30s maybe, sunburned across the back of his neck in a way that said he wasn't from around here. Or if he was, he hadn't been staying indoors much lately. He had a boy in the passenger seat, couldn't have been more than 4 or 5, peering out the window with the particular stillness of a kid who has learned not to ask questions when the adults are worried. The man's name was Walter Grady. He said it quiet, like it embarrassed him to be standing there at all. He told Ruth he'd come from 2 counties over, where the drought had hit even harder if that was possible. He'd lost most of his herd already, sold what he could, watched the rest go down to nothing but ribs and hollow eyes. He had 6 cows left. 6 cows he was trying to get to his brother-in-law's place 3 states north, where there'd been rain, where there was grass, where there was a chance. But his truck had broken down twice on the drive already. He'd spent what little money he had on a radiator hose and a tow, and the 6 cows he had left were standing in a borrowed trailer on the shoulder of the county road 2 miles back, because the truck had finally given out for good this time, and he didn't know what else to do. He wasn't asking for money. He said that twice, like he needed Ruth to understand he wasn't a beggar. He was asking if there was any hay he could buy, any at all, just enough to get those 6 animals through until he could figure out how to get them and his family the rest of the way north. Ruth stood there a long moment, looking past him at the little boy still sitting in the truck, watching them both through the dusty windshield. She thought about her 11 bales. She thought about her 43 cattle. She thought about Danny and Callie, and the winter that was still 4 months away, and already looming over her like a debt come due. And she thought about Frank, who used to say that a farmer who wouldn't help another farmer through a drought wasn't much of a farmer at all. He was just a landowner waiting for his turn to lose everything alone. "How many bales do you need?" she asked. Walter said he didn't want to take more than he had to, maybe 2 if she could spare them, maybe 3. Ruth looked at her hay barn. Then she looked at that little boy in the truck again. "Take what you need to get where you're going," she said. "All of it, if that's what it takes." Now, before I tell you what happened after that, because what Ruth did next isn't the part of this story people remember most, I want you to sit with that decision for a second, because in a minute, you're going to understand exactly what it cost her, and 20 years later, you're going to see exactly what it bought her, in a way none of us could have predicted. If stories like this move you the way they move me, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I read every single one, and it means the world to this channel. Walter Grady tried to argue with her. He said he couldn't take all of it, that it wasn't right, that she had her own herd to think about. But Ruth had already started loading the bales onto his trailer with a borrowed tractor from her nearest neighbor, and there is a particular kind of stubbornness in a woman who has already made up her mind, and Walter Grady didn't have the strength left to fight it. By sundown, all 11 bales were gone. Ruth's hay barn stood empty for the first time in her life. Walter shook her hand so hard it nearly hurt, and he told her he'd pay her back someday, somehow. He didn't know when or how, but he would. Ruth told him not to worry about it. She told him to just get that boy somewhere safe. Then the old Ford pulled away down the gravel drive, trailer rattling behind it, and Ruth Callahan stood in her yard as the dust settled, watching a stranger's taillights disappear toward the county road, and wondering, for just a moment, if she'd lost her mind. She never got his address, never got a phone number. In the chaos of loading hay before dark, in the exhaustion of a drought that had worn everybody down to the bone, the two of them had simply forgotten to exchange anything but a handshake and a promise neither one of them could put in writing. Ruth didn't tell her kids what she'd done until dinner that night. Danny didn't say much. Callie, 16 and sharper than her mother probably wanted her to be at that particular moment, asked the question that had to be asked. What are we going to feed the cattle now? Ruth didn't have an answer. Not that night. What followed was the hardest winter of Ruth Callahan's life. She sold 11 head of cattle at a loss just to bring the herd down to a number she could feed on what she could scrape together. Bought hay trucked in from 3 states away at prices that made her wince. Rationed grain, walked her fence lines every single morning checking for cattle that hadn't made it through the night. She took on part-time work at the feed store in town just to cover the difference. Danny and Callie picked up chores that weren't really chores for kids their age. Real labor. The kind that ages a person early. There were nights that winter when Ruth sat at her kitchen table with the bills spread out in front of her and wondered, honestly wondered, if she'd made a mistake. If kindness was a luxury a widow with 2 kids and a mortgage couldn't actually afford. If Frank's old philosophy about farmers helping farmers was the kind of thing that sounded good until you were the one paying for it. But every single one of her cattle survived that winter. Every one. Some years later, she'd tell people she never could explain how, whether it was luck, or stubbornness, or something else she didn't have a name for, but they made it. All of them. Barely, but they made it. And slowly, life moved forward the way it does. The rains came back the following spring. The grass came back green. Callie went off to college 2 years later, first in the family to do it. Danny stayed on, eventually taking over more and more of the operation as Ruth's knees started giving her trouble climbing in and out of the tractor. Ruth never heard from Walter Grady again. Not a letter, not a phone call. As the years went by, she thought about him less and less, not because it didn't matter to her, but because life on a working farm doesn't leave much room for looking backward. There's always another spring to plant, another winter to prepare for, another decision that needs making today, not yesterday. But every now and then, usually late in August, when the heat sat heavy over the fields the way it had in 1988, Ruth would find herself thinking about that little boy in the passenger seat of an old Ford, wondering if he'd grown up somewhere green, wondering if his father had ever made it to where he was going. She had no way of knowing that somewhere, 2 states north, that same question was being asked in reverse. That a boy who grew up hearing his father tell one story more than any other, the story of the winter a stranger gave away everything she had to save 6 cows and a family she'd never met, was growing into a man who never forgot the name on that handshake. Walter Grady had remembered one thing clearly. All those years, through every retelling at every dinner table, her name was Ruth Callahan, and she farmed some 160 acres in a county he could still find on a map if he tried. By 2008, Ruth Callahan was 64 years old. Danny ran most of the day-to-day now, though Ruth still couldn't quite bring herself to stop showing up at the barn every morning before sunrise, coffee in hand, checking on things the way she'd done for 3 decades. Callie had a family of her own 2 states over, a teaching job, kids who called their grandmother every Sunday. The farm looked different than it had in 1988. Bigger equipment, a new barn roof, a pole shed Danny had put up for the machinery. But the bones of the place were the same gravel drive, the same fence lines Ruth had walked 1,000 times, the same hay barn that had stood empty exactly once in 50 years of farming. It was a Saturday morning in late September when the truck came up the drive. Ruth was out front, same as she'd been 20 years earlier, though this time she was sitting on the porch rather than working a fence line. Her knees had finally won that particular argument. She heard the engine before she saw it. A newer truck this time, diesel, pulling a long flatbed trailer loaded down with hay, not 11 bales. Considerably more than that. A young man climbed out of the cab, late 20s, maybe 30. Something about the way he stood there for a second before approaching, hat in his hands, looking almost nervous, tugged at a memory Ruth couldn't quite place. "Are you Ruth Callahan?" he asked. She said she was. "My name's Thomas Grady," he said. "My father was Walter Grady. I don't know if that name means anything to you. It's been a long time." Ruth Callahan, 64 years old and not easily rattled by much of anything after the life she'd lived, felt something catch in her chest. "Walter Grady," she said slowly. "The Drought, 1988. Thomas nodded and something in his shoulders eased, like he'd been half afraid she wouldn't remember at all, or worse, that she'd remember and it wouldn't matter to her the way it had mattered to his family for 20 years. He told her the rest of the story then, standing in her driveway with a truckload of hay behind him. His father had made it north that winter, barely, with a truck that broke down one more time before the journey was through, but he'd made it, and those 6 cows had made it too, onto his brother-in-law's land where the grass grew tall and the drought hadn't reached. Walter Grady had rebuilt his herd from those 6 animals over the following years. Slowly, carefully, the way a man rebuilds something he almost lost. And every single year, on the anniversary of that Thursday afternoon in August, Walter Grady sat his kids down at the dinner table and told them the story of the woman who gave a stranger everything she had, no questions asked, at the exact moment she had the least to spare. He told them it wasn't really a story about hay. It was a story about what kind of person you decide to be when it costs you something to be that person. Anybody can be generous when generosity is easy. Ruth Callahan had been generous when it wasn't easy at all, when it meant real risk, real sacrifice, a winter she couldn't be certain she'd survive. Walter Grady had wanted, for 20 years, to pay that debt back. But life on a rebuilding farm doesn't leave much room for tracking down an address 2 states away, and pride is a strange thing. The longer a debt goes unpaid, the harder it can feel to show up and finally pay it. Walter Grady had passed away 8 months earlier. Heart trouble, same as it had been for so many farmers who worked themselves the way that generation worked. And in the weeks after the funeral, going through his father's things, Thomas had found a folded piece of paper in Walter's desk drawer, a name, written in his father's handwriting, and a county. Ruth Callahan. Never forget what she did. Pay her back if you ever get the chance. Thomas Grady had spent months tracking down where exactly that farm might be. He'd finally found it 3 weeks earlier. An old feed store owner 2 towns over remembered the Callahan name, pointed him in the right direction. And so he'd loaded up his own truck, hitched a trailer, and driven 2 states south with more hay than his father had ever asked to borrow in the first place. Not because Ruth needed it, not this year, not with a healthy herd and a full barn of her own. He drove it down because some debts aren't about need, they're about what it means to close a circle that's been open for 20 years. Ruth stood in her driveway with tears she didn't bother hiding, looking at a truckload of hay from a man she'd never met, sent by a father she'd never see again, in payment for a decision she'd made half a lifetime ago without ever expecting anything back. She told Thomas the truth, that she didn't need the hay, that her herd was smaller now and Danny kept things running well, that he didn't owe her a single thing and never had. Thomas told her something back that Ruth would repeat for the rest of her life, to anyone who'd listen, whenever the subject of hard times and hard decisions came up. He said his father hadn't sent the hay because Ruth needed it. He'd sent it because he needed her to have it. Because some kindnesses are too large to simply say thank you for. Because the only way his father knew how to close that debt, even from beyond it, was to make sure that whatever Ruth Callahan had given away in 1988 came back to her multiplied, whether she needed it or not. Danny came out from the barn partway through the conversation, and by the time the full story had been told twice over, once from Thomas, once from Ruth filling in her side, there wasn't a dry eye among the 3 of them standing in that driveway. Thomas stayed for supper that night. Ruth cooked the way she used to cook for the whole family on Sundays, and over the meal, Thomas told them more about his father, the herd he'd rebuilt from 6 starving cows, the farm he'd grown in the northern county, the way he used to stand in his own hay barn every August and tell his kids that the difference between a good year and a bad one usually came down to whether somebody, somewhere, was willing to give away what they couldn't spare. Before Thomas left the next morning, he unloaded every bale of that hay into Ruth's barn, the same barn that had stood empty exactly once, 20 years before, on a Thursday afternoon that changed the direction of 2 families for 2 decades and counting. Ruth Callahan kept a photograph on her kitchen wall after that, Thomas standing next to his loaded trailer, hat in his hands, the same nervous stance his father had once had standing in that very spot. Underneath it, she'd written a single line in her own handwriting. What you give away in hard times finds its way back, in its own time, in its own way. Bach. Ruth Callahan passed away in 2019, 81 years old, having farmed that 160 acres for over 4 decades. Danny runs it today. Callie's kids still visit every summer, and somewhere, in a farmhouse 2 states north, Thomas Grady tells his own children a story now, about his father, and a woman named Ruth, and 11 bales of hay that turned out to be worth a lot more than hay. There's a lesson in this story that's easy to say and much harder to live, that kindness given without any expectation of return has a way of finding its way back to you, sometimes decades later, in a form you never could have predicted. Ruth Callahan didn't help Walter Grady because she thought it would pay off. She helped him because it was the right thing to do, on a Thursday afternoon in a drought that had already taken so much from so many people, and she had just enough left to give. That's the kind of story we tell here on the Rural Files. The quiet ones, the true ones, the ones about ordinary people doing extraordinary things not for recognition, but because it's who they are. If this story meant something to you, I'd ask you to do 3 things. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next one. We've got stories coming that will absolutely break your heart in the best way. Drop a comment and tell me about a time someone showed you kindness you never expected to get back. And if you've got a story like Ruth's in your own family, a debt repaid, a kindness returned, a stranger who turned into something more, I want to hear it, because that's exactly what this channel is here for.